My son took in a troubled youth, and an old photo revealed he was my lost grandson, heir to $3.7 million. I never thought those words would come out of my mouth. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for just a second, feel like this sounds familiar, I only ask that you leave a like and subscribe. It will help me to keep unburdening my soul. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 63 years old, and I live in a small apartment in Queens, New York, where silence has become my only companion. The walls of my home are stained with dampness, and the drips from the ceiling mark the rhythm of my lonely days. Every morning, I wake up to the sound of New York traffic seeping through poorly sealed windows, and every night, I eat dinner in front of a turned-off television because I no longer have anyone to talk to. The apartment smells of lavender and loneliness. The yellowed photos on the dining table show faces that once smiled at me, but now they seem like ghosts from the past. My son Ethan, with his big brown eyes and that smile he inherited from his father. My daughter-in-law Rachel, always perfectly coiffed, always with that expression of someone in a hurry to be somewhere else. My grandchildren, who grew up so fast I barely recognize them in the latest pictures I have. Routine has become my jailer. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I clean houses on the Upper East Side, dragging my arthritic knees across marble floors that shine brighter than my future. The weight of the vacuum cleaner feels heavier in my arms each day, and the ladies I work for treat me as if I were invisible, like a piece of furniture they can move at will. In the afternoons when I get home, I sit on the tiny balcony overlooking the street and watch the families pass by. Young mothers pushing strollers, grandparents holding hands with their grandkids, couples walking without a care, enjoying each other's company. I was part of that world once. I had a husband who waited for me at home, a son who needed me, a life that made sense. Everything changed 5 years ago, when my husband Anthony died of a heart attack while pruning the roses in our small backyard. Since then, my world has shrunk to the size of this matchbox I live in, where every object reminds me of what I've lost and what I'll never get back. Ethan comes to see me once a month if I'm lucky, always in a rush, always with his phone in his hand, always with that look of someone fulfilling a tiresome but necessary obligation. Rachel, his wife, stopped coming with him years ago. The last time I saw her, she told me with that fake smile she practices so well, "Eleanor, you understand that people our age have our own lives, right?" As if my 63 years had turned me into a walking inconvenience. My grandchildren, Chloe, 16, and Parker, 14, know me more from photographs than from shared moments. When Ethan occasionally brings them, they sit on the couch with their eyes glued to their phones, answering my questions about school, friends, and dreams with monosyllables. It's like talking to ghosts who are in a hurry to disappear. But 3 months ago, something changed. Ethan showed up at my door on a Tuesday afternoon without calling first, which was strange in itself. He brought with him a scruffy-looking young man with messy brown hair and clothes that had seen better days. The boy couldn't have been more than 17, with eyes that seemed to carry more stories than his age should allow. "Mom, this is Simon," Ethan told me in that serious tone he used for business. "He's a special case. We're taking him in for a while. He's lost, needs some direction." The boy looked at me with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, like a wild animal unsure if it can trust the stranger in front of it. His hands were buried deep in the pockets of an oversized gray hoodie, and his hunched posture spoke of someone who had learned to make himself small in the world. "And where do you know this boy from?" I asked Ethan, genuinely curious. My son, who hadn't shown compassion even for his own mother in years, was now opening his home to a complete stranger. "He's a troubled kid. No family. I'm helping him because I can," he answered with that coldness he had perfected over the years. He was living on the streets. Rachel and I decided to give him a chance. Something about that explanation didn't sit right with me. Ethan, who constantly complained about family expenses, who reminded me whenever he could how costly it was to support his family, was now playing benefactor to a stranger. But I said nothing. I had learned long ago that my opinions weren't welcome in my son's decisions. That night, after they left, I lay awake thinking about the boy. There was something familiar in his eyes, something that gave me a strange feeling in my stomach. like when you sense it's going to rain before the clouds appear. The following days, I started seeing Simon frequently from my window. He would sit on the sidewalk in front of Ethan's building, just 2 blocks from my place, and stay there for hours, staring at the sky with a sadness that felt painfully familiar. It was the same expression I saw in the mirror every morning, that of someone who feels lost in their own life. One afternoon, I dared to go down and approach him. I brought him a cup of hot chocolate I had made, the kind I used to make for Ethan when he was little and had nightmares. "Hello, Simon," I said, offering him the steaming mug. "I thought you might be cold." He looked at me, surprised, as if it were the first time in a long while that someone had approached him without asking for something in return. "Thanks, ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in days. His hands trembled slightly as he took the mug, and I noticed his knuckles were scraped, as if he'd been in a fight or sleeping in rough places. We sat in silence for a few minutes. He drank the chocolate in small sips, savoring every drop as if it were the first warm thing he'd tasted in weeks. I watched him, trying to figure out what was so familiar about his gestures. The way he furrowed his brow slightly when he was thinking, how he'd lower his gaze when he felt watched, the way his fingers drummed nervously against the mug. It all reminded me of someone, but my mind refused to connect the dots. "Have you known my son for long?" I asked gently, trying not to sound intrusive. Simon shrugged, a gesture that could mean anything. "A couple of weeks, maybe." He found me in a tough spot. He didn't offer any more details, and I didn't push. There was something in his eyes that spoke of wounds too fresh to be touched by a stranger's questions. That night, after Simon went back to Ethan's apartment, I stayed by the window longer than usual. The lights of the city twinkled like fallen stars, and I got lost in memories of everything I had given for my family over the years. I remembered when Ethan was 8 and got pneumonia. I worked double shifts at a garment workshop for 3 months to pay for the medicine insurance wouldn't cover. My hands were covered in calluses from handling the industrial sewing machines. But I didn't care. It was for my son. When he turned 18 and wanted to go to business school, I sold my mother's jewelry, including the engagement ring that had belonged to my grandmother. Each piece held a story, a memory, but I exchanged them for his private university tuition because Ethan insisted that the state schools weren't on the same level. On his graduation day, I sat in the last row of the auditorium because Rachel had forgotten to save me a seat with the family. I watched them from a distance. Ethan walking onto the stage, Rachel clapping with tears in her eyes, her parents taking pictures with professional cameras. I clapped alone, from my corner, wearing the dress I'd worn to my own wedding, because it was the only formal thing I owned. After the ceremony, when I went to congratulate him, Rachel intercepted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Eleanor, so glad you could make it. It's a shame there wasn't more room at the restaurant table. You know how these celebrations are, just immediate family." "But I'm his mother," I said, not understanding. Of course, but you get it. Those are the rules of the place. Very strict about reservations." I saw Ethan walk away with Rachel on his arm, laughing with his in-laws, without even turning to say goodbye. That day I took the subway home, my wedding dress wrinkled and my heart in pieces, but that wasn't the only time. When Chloe, his first child, was born, I spent days cooking homemade meals to bring them while Rachel recovered. Hearty beef stews, homemade casseroles, things that took me hours to prepare because my hands no longer had the agility they once did. "Eleanor, this is so heavy," Rachel would say every time she opened the containers. "Couldn't you make something more modern? Something that doesn't smell so much like old-fashioned country cooking?" I stopped cooking for them. They started ordering takeout. When Parker was born 2 years later, I offered to watch Chloe while they were at the hospital. The little girl was just 2 and was crying for her mom. I spent 3 nights without sleep, singing her the same songs I used to sing to Ethan when he had nightmares, preparing her warm milk just the way I knew she liked it. When they returned from the hospital, Rachel checked Chloe from head to toe as if she had been in the hands of a dangerous stranger. "Did you give her sweets? Her face is all puffy," she asked in an accusatory tone. "Just a little bit of honey in her milk to help her sleep better." "Eleanor, kids these days can't have honey. Don't you know anything about modern pediatrics? Please, next time ask before you give her anything." There was no next time. They never asked me to babysit again. The years went by, and every birthday, every Christmas, every special day became a silent negotiation. I would buy gifts that my grandchildren opened with disinterest. Rachel would discreetly put them aside and later exchange them for something more appropriate. On Chloe's 10th birthday, I arrived with a doll I had seen in a toy store window. It wasn't expensive, but it was pretty, with a blue dress that reminded me of one I wore as a child. Chloe took it, mumbled a, "Thanks, Grandma," and left it on the table without another glance. "Chloe doesn't play with dolls anymore, Eleanor," Rachel explained later, with the exaggerated patience one uses with small children. "She's into video games and electronics now, things that are more age-appropriate." I saw the doll on the table, abandoned among the dirty plates and crumpled napkins, and something inside my chest tightened like a clenched fist. Last year, when I turned 62, I waited all day for the phone to ring. I had baked a small chocolate cake, the same recipe I used for Ethan's birthdays when he was a boy. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the landline on the counter, waiting. At 9 o'clock at night, after I had put the untouched cake in the fridge, I received a text from Ethan. "Happy birthday, Mom. Hugs. Hugs," in a text message, for the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him a better life. That night, I cried for the first time in months, my face buried in a pillow so the neighbors wouldn't hear me. I cried for all the forgotten birthdays, for all the times I had set the table for two knowing I would eat alone, for all the conversations I'd had with the walls because I had no one else to talk to. But what hurt the most wasn't the loneliness. It was the gradual understanding that everything I had done, all my sacrifices, had been interpreted as obligations. As if being a mother had made me a perpetual debtor. As if the love I had given was a loan I would never finish paying back. And now, seeing this abandoned boy my son had decided to rescue, I couldn't help but wonder why a stranger deserved the compassion his own mother had never received. What did Simon have that I had lost so long ago? The next few days dragged on with the heaviness of lead. I woke up each morning hoping that maybe today would be different, that maybe Ethan would call just to ask how I was, without needing anything in return. But the phone remained silent, a quiet witness to my irrelevance. On Wednesday morning, while cleaning Mrs. Martinez's house on the Upper East Side, I overheard a phone conversation that broke my heart. She was talking to her daughter, who lived in Chicago, arranging a family visit for the weekend. "Yes, honey. I'll get your room ready just like always. Are you bringing the kids? Perfect. I'll make that roast chicken they love so much. No, it's no trouble. It's a pleasure. That's what grandparents are for." I stood frozen, cleaning rag in hand, feeling how each word was a stab. When was the last time someone had told me my presence was a pleasure and not a burden? That afternoon, walking home through the bustling streets of downtown, I stopped in front of a cafe where a young grandmother, maybe my age, was sharing ice cream with her granddaughter. The little girl was telling her something animatedly, gesturing with hands covered in chocolate, and the grandmother laughed with that genuine laugh that comes from the gut. I stood there, watching them through the glass, until the grandmother noticed me and gave me a kind smile. I had to walk away quickly, because I felt tears welling up in my eyes. When I got to my apartment, I found a note slipped under the door. It was from my neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who lived alone like me but at least had regular visits from her nephews. "Eleanor, tomorrow is my granddaughter's birthday, and I'm having a small celebration. You're welcome to join us if you'd like. No need to bring anything, just your company." I read the note 3 times before the words truly sank in. Someone was inviting me. Someone wanted my company. It was so strange that for a moment I thought I had misunderstood. But the next day, when I peeked into the hallway, I could hear the laughter and conversation coming from Mrs. Johnson's apartment. I stood in front of my door for half an hour, wearing the blue dress I had ironed especially for the occasion, but I couldn't bring myself to ring her bell. What if my presence ruined the atmosphere? What if I had nothing interesting to contribute to their family conversations? I stayed in my apartment, listening through the wall to the sounds of a celebration from which I had been deliberately excluded by my own cowardice. On Friday, as I was returning from the market with my lonely shopping bag for one, I saw Simon again, sitting in his usual spot in front of Ethan's building. This time he had a book in his hands, which surprised me. Not many kids his age read physical books these days. I approached him curiously. "What are you reading?" He looked up and showed me the cover. It was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a book I had read decades ago when I still had time for literature and dreams. "It's complicated," he said with a shy smile. "But I like how he writes about family, even if all the families in the book are a little broken. Like all real families," I replied without thinking, and immediately felt ashamed for sounding so bitter. But Simon nodded with an understanding that seemed far too mature for his age. "You think all families are dysfunctional?" I sat down next to him on the curb, ignoring the dampness from the ground seeping through my skirt. "I think most people hurt the ones they love most, and they do it without even realizing it. Or realizing it perfectly well," he added, with a bitterness that made me wonder what stories he carried in those young eyes. We spent the next hour talking about the book, about Garcia Marquez's lonely characters, about how time becomes circular when you live in abandonment. Simon had a way of speaking that reminded me of someone, but I couldn't place who. When it got dark, and he said goodbye to go back to Ethan's apartment, I stayed sitting on the curb a while longer. It had been the most interesting conversation I'd had in months, and it was with a boy I barely knew. Saturday morning, the phone rang. It was Rachel, her voice laced with that artificial sweetness she used when she needed something. "Eleanor, darling, how are you? It's been so long since we've talked." 3 months, I replied automatically. "We spoke 3 months ago." There was an awkward pause. "Well, yes. Time flies when you're busy. Look, I'm calling because we need a small favor. Chloe has a really important school project. She needs to do a presentation on our family history, and we thought maybe you could help her with some anecdotes, old photos, that sort of thing." My heart leaped. Finally, after so long, they wanted me to be useful for something related to my grandchildren. "Of course," I said, perhaps too quickly. "I can come whenever you want. I have lots of photos, stories from when Ethan was a boy, about my parents, about—" "Perfect. You can come over early Sunday morning. Chloe has a tennis lesson at 11, so you could get here at 8 and leave by 10:30. Ethan will be playing golf, but that's fine. We just need the information. 2.5 hours. They had allotted me 2.5 hours to share decades of family history with my granddaughter. But it was something. It was more than I'd had in a long time. On Sunday, I arrived promptly, with a box full of chronologically organized photographs, family documents, and some letters my mother had written to me in her final years. I had spent all of Saturday night organizing the materials, excited to have something valuable to offer. Chloe opened the door in her pajamas, hair disheveled and a just-woken-up look on her face. "Oh, hi, Grandma. Mom said you were coming." Rachel appeared behind her, already dressed and ready to go out. "Eleanor, so punctual. Look, I have to run to the gym, but Chloe knows what she needs." "Right, sweetie." Chloe nodded without much enthusiasm as Rachel grabbed her keys and headed for the door. "I'm off. Chloe, remember you have to be ready for tennis at 10:30. "Eleanor, thanks so much for helping." And she was gone, leaving me alone with my 16-year-old granddaughter, who would clearly rather be sleeping in on a Sunday morning. "Well, Chloe, I brought lots of interesting things," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic as I opened my box of family treasures. "Here are pictures of your dad when he was little. Look how funny he was with those buck teeth. And here are your great-grandparents, my parents, on their wedding day." Chloe looked at the photos with the same expression she might have while browsing an appliance catalog. "Uh-huh. And this will work for my presentation?" "Of course. You can talk about family traditions, about what life was like back then, about the values that have been passed down. My presentation is on the economic evolution of American families over the last 50 years, she interrupted. "I need hard data, figures, not so much this. My memories, my history, my entire life reduced to this, as if it were useless junk. Well, I can tell you about what the economy was like when I was young, about the hardships we faced, about how your grandfather and I saved up to buy our first house." Chloe yawned without trying to hide it. "Do you have any official documents? Work contracts? Deeds? Anything I can scan?" I spent the next 2 hours watching my granddaughter take quick photos of some documents with her phone, completely ignoring the stories I tried to tell her. She wasn't interested in knowing that her great-grandfather had been a baker for 40 years, or that I had worked in a garment workshop to help pay for her father's education. At 10:30 sharp, she stood up from the table. "Well, Grandma, I think I have what I need. Thanks for coming." I gathered my photographs, my letters, my scorned memories, and put them back in the box with trembling hands. Chloe had already gone to her room to get ready for tennis. I left that house feeling even emptier than when I had arrived. In the elevator, looking at myself in the mirror, I saw an old woman with misty eyes and wondered when exactly I had stopped mattering. When had I become a disposable resource instead of a grandmother? That afternoon, after returning from Ethan's house with a shattered heart and trampled dignity, I sat on my worn-out sofa and looked at the box of photographs Chloe had rejected like old trash. My hands shook as I held them, each image a fragment of a life that apparently no longer held value for anyone. Suddenly, I remembered something I had completely forgotten. Years ago, when Anthony was still alive, we had stored some important things in the storage unit in the basement. Photos, documents, memories of better times that we didn't want to throw away but couldn't keep in our small apartment. With a mix of curiosity and desperation, I went down the creaky stairs to the building's damp basement. The smell of mold and accumulated years hit me like a slap, but I pressed on. My unit was at the end of the hall, secured by a rusty padlock that took several minutes to open. Inside were dusty boxes, once important furniture, and objects that had lost their purpose but kept their emotional weight. In a corner, I found the box I was looking for. It was labeled in Anthony's shaky handwriting, "Important Memories, 1985-2005. I carried it back to my apartment with the care of someone transporting a treasure. Upon opening it, the scent of old paper and frozen time enveloped me like an embrace from the past. There were photographs I hadn't seen in decades, love letters Anthony wrote me when he worked out of state, and documents from important moments in our lives. But it was at the bottom of the box that I found something that made me hold my breath, a photograph I had completely forgotten, but that now stared back at me with a clarity that chilled me to the bone. It was Isabella Hayes, Ethan's first wife, the young woman with big eyes and a shy smile who had been my daughter-in-law for just 2 years, before everything became complicated and painful. In the photo, she was sitting on the sofa of my old house, her hands protectively resting on her swollen belly, about 6 or 7 months pregnant. I remembered that day perfectly now. We had gone to Central Park that morning. Isabella had insisted on feeding the ducks at the pond despite her advanced pregnancy. "It's good for the baby to hear the sounds of nature," she had told me with that sweetness that characterized her. My grandmother used to say that children who are born hearing music and water grow up happier. When we got home, I had taken that photo while she rested on the sofa. Anthony was in the kitchen making dinner, whistling a Bob Dylan song, and everything seemed perfect. We were a family awaiting the arrival of a new life, but on the back of the photograph, in Isabella's careful handwriting, was something that made me tremble. "For my dear mother-in-law, Eleanor, this baby will have your kindness and your strength. If anything happens to me, please take care of him for me. With all my love, Isabella." March 2006. March 2006. 2 months before Isabella disappeared from our lives forever. My hands shook so much I nearly dropped the photo. The memories came flooding back like an avalanche. Isabella had disappeared in May 2006, when she was 8 months pregnant. Ethan had come home one day, pale as a ghost, saying she had left, that she had decided she didn't want to be a mother, that she had abandoned everything and left without a trace. She didn't want the baby, he had told me with dry eyes, without a single tear. She said she was too young, that she wasn't ready. She went to live with relatives in another state. The baby didn't make it. I had cried for weeks. Isabella was not the type of woman to abandon her family. I had seen how she caressed her belly, how she talked to the baby, how she excitedly prepared the nursery. Something about Ethan's story didn't add up, but I never dared to question him directly. It was his wife, his life, his pain. Now, looking at the photograph and doing the math in my head, I realized something that left me breathless. If Isabella was pregnant in March 2006 and disappeared in May of that year, the baby would have been born in July or August of 2006. Simon had said he was 17 years old, born in 2006. With trembling hands, I studied the photograph under a lamp, looking for details I had missed. Isabella's eyes, large, expressive, with that melancholic gaze that seemed to see beyond the obvious. Exactly like Simon's eyes, the shape of her nose. Delicate, slightly upturned. Like Simon's, the line of her jaw. Soft but defined, like Simon's. And something else. Something that had been bothering me since the first time I saw the boy. The way he moved his hands when he talked, with elegant, expressive gestures. Exactly like Isabella used to do when she told me about her literature classes at college. I shot up from the sofa as if I'd been hit by an electric shock and began pacing my small apartment. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Why had Ethan suddenly decided to rescue a troubled youth from the street? Why was that youth the exact age Isabella's son would be? Why did Simon have those gestures, that gaze, that way of speaking that reminded me so much of her? And more importantly, what had really happened to Isabella? I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of my room, clutching the photograph of Isabella to my chest. My mind worked feverishly, connecting dots I had ignored for 17 years. I remembered the last time I had seen Isabella. She had come to my house in the middle of the afternoon, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands shaking. She asked if she could speak with me alone, without Ethan. "Eleanor," she had said, her voice breaking, "if something happens to me, if one day I'm not here, I want you to know that this baby is the most important thing in the world to me. No matter what others tell you, no matter what version you hear, this child is loved and wanted." At the time, I thought it was just typical pregnancy nerves, the natural fears of a first-time mother. But now, remembering her exact words, they sounded like a farewell, a warning, a last will. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. I left Mrs. Martinez's house half-cleaned and rushed out, using the excuse that I felt sick. It wasn't a lie. I felt physically and emotionally ill. I needed to see Simon. I needed to look him in the eye and ask him directly about his past. But when I got to the spot where he usually sat, he wasn't there. I spent the whole afternoon waiting, but he didn't show up. Not the next day either. On Wednesday, I finally saw him. He was carrying some bags into Ethan's building, accompanied by my son. From a distance, I could see they were arguing. Ethan's gestures were aggressive, authoritarian. Simon's were defensive and hurt. I couldn't get closer because Ethan had spotted me and was making it clear I wasn't welcome. But I watched the interaction from my window, and what I saw confirmed my suspicions. Ethan wasn't treating Simon like a needy youth he was helping out of kindness. He was treating him like someone who owed him something, like someone under his control, like a son he had kept secret for 17 years. That evening, I gathered all the courage I had left and dialed my son's number. When he answered with his usual impatient tone, I asked the question that had been burning in my throat for days. "Ethan, I want you to tell me the truth about Simon. Who is that boy, really?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. So long that for a moment I thought he had hung up. "He's a kid I'm helping, Mom. I already told you." "And his last name? His family? Where is he from exactly?" Another silence, tenser than the last. Why all the questions? Don't you have enough of your own problems? The coldness in his voice chilled me to the bone, but I persisted. "Ethan, I found a photograph of Isabella, pregnant, with a message written to me." This time the silence was deafening. "I don't know what photo you're talking about, Mom. Isabella left a long time ago. Forget the past and stop making up fantasies." And he hung up. But in his voice, in those silences, in his refusal to give me a straight answer, I found all the confirmation I needed. Simon wasn't a stranger Ethan had decided to help out of charity. Simon was my grandson, the grandson who had been stolen from me for 17 years. The next few days passed in a haze. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the picture of Isabella, her sweet smile, her hands protecting her unborn baby. Every time I looked out the window and saw Simon, My heart raced with a mix of desperate love and blind rage. He was my grandson. I knew it in my bones, in my blood, in that part of the soul that recognizes family even when the mind refuses to accept the truth. But I also knew I needed more than a grandmother's intuition to confront Ethan. I needed proof. I needed Simon himself to confirm what my heart already knew. On Thursday morning, while pretending to read the newspaper at the small corner cafe, I saw Rachel leave the building loaded with gym bags and the hurried attitude of someone with a very busy schedule. Ethan had left half an hour earlier in his car, probably heading to the office. It was my chance. I walked up the stairs of the building with my heart pounding so hard I was afraid it would burst out of my chest. When I rang the doorbell, Simon answered. He seemed surprised to see me, but not uncomfortable. "Hi, Mrs. Vance. I didn't know you were coming. May I come in? I need to talk to you about something important." He let me into the apartment I knew so well, the same one where I had celebrated Chloe and Parker's first birthdays, where I had cooked Christmas dinners no one remembered fondly, where I had been slowly relegated to the role of an annoying visitor instead of a beloved grandmother. We sat on the new sofa Rachel had bought last year, one of those minimalist pieces that are more stylish than comfortable. Simon looked at me with those eyes I now knew the origin of, waiting for me to speak. I pulled the photograph of Isabella from my purse with slightly trembling hands. I showed it to him without saying anything at first, carefully watching his reaction. I saw his face transform. First confusion, then recognition, then a mix of pain and longing that broke my heart. "Do you know this woman?" I asked in a soft voice, though inside I was screaming. Simon took the photograph with a delicacy that reminded me exactly of how Isabella used to handle fragile things. He studied it for long moments, and I saw his eyes moisten. I've seen her in dreams," he finally said, his voice cracking. "Ever since I was little, I've dreamed of a woman who looks exactly like her. She would sing me lullabies. She would tell me she loved me. I always thought they were just fantasies because I never had a mother." "You never had a mother? What were you told about your parents?" He ran a hand through his hair with a gesture that was painfully familiar. Ethan did the exact same thing when he felt pressured. "I was raised in different foster homes since I was a baby. The social workers told me my parents died in a car accident when I was a few months old, that I had no family, that I was all alone in the world." Every word was a stab. 17 years. 17 years during which this boy had grown up believing he was an orphan, while I mourned the loss of a grandson I thought had died before he was born. "Simon," I said, and my voice broke as I spoke his name. "This woman in the photograph was named Isabella. She was my son Ethan's wife, your father." I saw the blood drain from his face. He shot up from the sofa as if it had caught fire, walking towards the window with unsteady steps. "That's impossible. Ethan rescued me from the street a month ago. He told me I had no family, that he was giving me a chance because he was a good person. If he were my father, why would he—" He didn't finish the sentence, but we both knew how it ended. If he were his father, why had he abandoned him for 17 years? Why had he allowed him to grow up in the foster care system? Why was he now treating him like a stranger he was doing a favor for? "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know you are my grandson. I feel it here." I touched my chest, and I see it in every gesture you make. You have your mother's smile, her hands, the way you tilt your head when you think. Simon turned to me, tears streaming down his cheeks. "My mother? Is she still alive?" The question shattered me. I had to admit I didn't know, that Isabella had disappeared when he was just a baby, and that for all these years, I had assumed both she and the baby had died. "But if you're here, if you're alive, then maybe she's alive too," he finished, with desperate hope in his voice. We spent the next 2 hours sharing memories and information. I told him everything I remembered about Isabella, her love for literature, her kindness to everyone, how she spoke to her pregnant belly as if it were already her best friend. He told me about his childhood in foster homes, about how he always felt different, like he belonged somewhere else. "I always had this feeling," he told me, "like a part of me was missing. Like there were people in the world who loved me but couldn't find me. I was looking for you," I told him, though I knew it wasn't entirely true. In my heart, I never stopped looking for you. When we heard keys in the door, we both tensed. It was Rachel, back from the gym. Simon looked at me in a panic. What do I do? Do I tell her we talked? Not yet, I whispered. First, we need more answers. We need to know what really happened to your mother. Rachel entered the apartment with her usual energy, all smiles and superficial chatter. She greeted me with her customary feigned surprise. Eleanor, how unexpected. Is everything all right? I just came to get to know Simon better, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. He's a very interesting young man. I saw Rachel and Simon exchange a quick glance. There was something there, some kind of silent communication I didn't fully understand. Well, I hope you haven't been boring poor Eleanor with your stories, Simon, Rachel said with that artificial laugh she used to fill awkward silences. Not at all, I answered before he could speak. It's been very educational. I left shortly after, but not before giving Simon a hug that lasted a little longer than socially acceptable. I needed him to feel that he wasn't alone, that he now had family who knew and loved him. That night, I couldn't sleep, thinking about everything I had discovered. My grandson had been meters away for a month, and I had seen him as a stranger. He had grown up without family love, without knowing his roots, without knowing he had a grandmother who would have given anything to raise him. But I also thought about Ethan, about how he had lied for 17 years, about how he had allowed his own son to grow up an orphan while he built a new family, about how he was now rescuing him for some hidden motive I couldn't yet decipher. The next day, I gathered my courage and called several hospitals in New York City, asking for records of a woman named Isabella Hayes who would have given birth in July or August of 2006. After hours of calls and transfers, I finally found something. At Mount Sinai Hospital, they had a record. Isabella Hayes had been admitted on August 15, 2006, in critical condition. She had given birth to a healthy baby boy, but she had passed away 3 days later due to postpartum complications. The baby had been released to the father, Ethan Vance. I hung up the phone with shaking hands. Isabella was dead. She had died giving birth to Simon, but the baby had been released to Ethan, not to the foster care system. What had my son done with his own newborn child? And why now, after 17 years, had he brought him back? That evening, when I saw Ethan arrive from work, I knew the time for the final confrontation had come. I went down to the street and intercepted him before he could get to his apartment. Ethan, we need to talk. Now. He looked at me with that expression of annoyance he had perfected over the years, but something in my tone made him realize that this time, I wasn't going to be ignored. What do you want to talk about, Mom? I have work to finish. I want to talk about Simon, about who he really is, about why you're lying about him. I saw his jaw tighten, his eyes harden. I already told you. It's none of your business. He's my grandson, I said, my voice one I didn't recognize as my own. He's Isabella's son, and I want to know why for 17 years you made me believe he was dead. The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife. In Ethan's eyes, I saw confirmation, guilt, and something darker I didn't want to identify. You don't know what you're talking about, he finally said, but his voice had lost all conviction. I know exactly what I'm talking about, and I'm going to find out the whole truth, with or without your help. Ethan stared at me for long seconds, as if calculating exactly how much damage my knowledge of the truth could cause him. Finally, he exhaled deeply and motioned for me to follow him to a bench in the small square across from our building. You want the truth? He said, in a voice I had never heard from him before. There was something broken in it, but also something cruel. Fine. It's about time someone else carried this secret. He sat next to me but kept his distance, as if my presence contaminated him. The park's lampposts began to flicker on, creating yellow circles of light that made his face look older, more tired. Isabella died in childbirth, he began, without looking me in the eye. Complications. The doctors said the baby was lucky to survive. When they put him in my arms, I felt nothing. His words froze my blood, but I forced myself to stay silent. I needed to hear everything. I was 22, Mom. I had just started my career. I had plans, ambitions, and suddenly they hand me this baby that cried constantly. that needed 24-hour attention, that represented everything I didn't want in my life. "He was your son," I whispered, but he continued as if he hadn't heard me. "Rachel and I had just started dating. She was perfect, educated, from a good family, with connections that could help me professionally. Do you think she would have stayed interested if I showed up with a crying baby on my arm? Do you think her parents would have accepted me as a son-in-law if they knew I had a child with a woman they barely knew?" The coldness in his voice made me nauseous. This was my son, the boy I had raised, whom I had taught family values and compassion. Where had I failed as a mother? "So you put him up for adoption," I said, trying to understand. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "I tried. I went to several agencies. But the process was complicated. There was paperwork, background checks, references. And there was always the risk that someone would find out. New York is a small town when it comes to certain social circles." "What did you do?" I asked, though a part of me no longer wanted to know the answer. I knew a guy who worked in social services who could make a baby disappear from the official system and reappear as an orphan somewhere else. No questions asked, no trail that could lead back to me. I pressed a hand to my chest. My heart was beating so hard I thought I would have a heart attack right there, in the square where I used to take Ethan to play when he was little. "I paid him," he continued in the same monotone voice, "a considerable amount to have Simon transferred to a foster home in Ohio, far from New York, with documents registering him as an orphan from birth, father unknown." "You paid him to abandon your own son?" The words came out as a choked cry. "I paid him to give me my life back," he corrected me without remorse. "And it worked. I married Rachel. I built my career. I had the family I wanted to have. Chloe and Parker are planned, wanted children who came at the right time. And you never thought about him? About Simon? About how he was growing up?" Ethan shrugged with an indifference that terrified me. "What for? He was a closed chapter of my life, until 2 months ago." "What happened 2 months ago?" "I got a call from that same contact in social services. Apparently there was a problem. Simon had turned 17, he was aging out of the foster care system, and during a routine file review, they had found irregularities." My heart stopped. "What kind of irregularities?" It turned out Isabella had left a life insurance policy, a substantial one, with the baby as the sole beneficiary. Investigators were starting to connect the dots, to look for the real father. It was only a matter of time before they found me. Now I was beginning to understand. Ethan hadn't rescued Simon out of kindness or delayed remorse. He had brought him back because he was under investigation. "How much money, Ethan?" $3.7 million. The figure left me breathless. Isabella, that sweet girl who lived so modestly, had a life insurance policy of almost $4 million. Her parents, Ethan continued, died in a plane crash when she was 18. They owned several real estate properties in Chicago. She was an only child. She inherited everything, but she never told me. She lived as if she had nothing because she was that humble. And now Simon is the legal heir, I understood. Exactly. But there's a problem. To claim the inheritance, he needs to be officially recognized as Isabella's son. And for that, he needs me to recognize him as my son too. That's why you brought him back. I brought him back because I had no choice. If I didn't recognize him voluntarily, the investigators would have kept digging until they uncovered the whole truth. My career, my marriage, my reputation, everything would have been over. I stood up from the bench, unable to sit still as I processed the magnitude of my son's cruelty. "So, your plan is to recognize him, help him get the inheritance, and then he can do whatever he wants with his life, and I with mine. He's an adult, or close enough. He doesn't need anyone to take care of him. And what about me? The fact that I'm his grandmother? That I spent 17 years crying for a grandson I thought was dead?" Ethan looked at me with that cold expression he had perfected over the years. "You don't exist in this equation, Mom. Simon doesn't need a senile grandmother filling his head with sentimental nonsense. He needs independence to manage his money and his future." I felt as if I had been slapped. Senile grandmother? Please. You live in a rundown apartment? You work cleaning other people's houses? You don't have enough money for your own expenses? What could you possibly offer a boy who's about to inherit millions? His words cut deeper than any knife. It was the culmination of years of contempt, the verbalization of what he had always thought of me but never said so clearly. I am his family, I said in a trembling voice. You're a stranger who shares some genes with him, nothing more. That night, after Ethan went up to his apartment as if he had been discussing the price of tomatoes at the market, I was left alone in the square. Tears streamed down my cheeks, but for the first time in years, they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of rage. My son had abandoned his own baby for social convenience. He had lied for 17 years. He had allowed me to suffer, believing my grandson was dead. And now he intended to use him to claim a multi-million-dollar inheritance, keeping me excluded as if I were a nuisance. But there was something Ethan didn't know, something he had completely underestimated, that I had rights as a grandmother too, and that Simon deserved to know the whole truth about his story. The next day, early in the morning, I went straight to Ethan's apartment. Rachel opened the door with her usual expression of disguised annoyance. Eleanor, so early. The kids are having breakfast. I need to speak with Simon, alone. I don't think that's a good idea. Ethan said, I don't care what Ethan said, I interrupted with a firmness that surprised even myself. I am going to speak with my grandson. Now. Rachel stepped back, probably more out of surprise than respect. I walked into the apartment and found Simon in the kitchen, eating cereal while Chloe and Parker completely ignored him, each absorbed in their phone. Simon, can we go for a walk? There are things you need to know. He looked at me with those eyes I now knew came from Isabella and nodded. He got up from the table, leaving his bowl half full. Let's go, he said simply. As we left the apartment, I heard Rachel make a quick phone call, probably to warn Ethan that I was causing trouble, but I no longer cared what they thought of me. For the first time in years, I had something more important to do than worry about the opinions of a family that had never valued me. I had to save my grandson. We walked in silence through the neighborhood's paved streets until we reached Central Park. It was a place I had visited thousands of times, but this morning it felt different, as if I were seeing it with new eyes. The ancient trees, the winding paths, the pond where families fed the ducks, everything seemed more vivid, more real. We sat on the same bench where, according to my memories, Isabella had insisted on resting during her last trimester. It was as if life had come full circle, bringing us back to where it all began. Simon? I started, taking his hands in mine. They were young but already calloused, hands that had worked too hard, too soon in life. What I'm about to tell you is going to hurt you deeply, but you need to know the whole truth about your story. He looked at me with those eyes that I now knew came directly from his mother, filled with a mix of hope and fear. I told him everything, every horrible detail, every calculated lie, every moment of deliberate cruelty. I told him how Ethan had abandoned him for convenience, how he had paid to erase him from his life, how for 17 years he had built a perfect family while his firstborn son grew up alone in the world. I watched the color drain from his face. His hands trembled in mine, and for a moment, I feared he would faint. And the inheritance? He finally asked, his voice hoarse. Your mother was rich, Simon, very rich, and she left you everything. But Ethan didn't bring you back out of love or remorse. He brought you back because he needs you to acknowledge him as your father, so they can legally access that inheritance together. Together? He thinks he can manipulate you, that he can make you believe he's your savior and benefactor. He expects that when you get the money you'll be grateful, that you'll share it with him, because he rescued you. Simon got up from the bench and began to pace, exactly as I had done when I discovered the photograph. It was incredible how genes manifested themselves even in moments of crisis. And you? He asked suddenly. Do you want something from this inheritance too? The question hurt, but I understood why he asked it. For 17 years, every person in his life had approached or left him with ulterior motives. The only thing I want, I told him with complete honesty, is to get back the 17 years we lost. I want to know the man you've become despite everything you've suffered. I want to be the grandmother your mother hoped I would be. He stopped in front of me and looked at me for a long moment, as if he were making a decision that would change his life forever. What do we do now? he finally asked. Now, I said, rising from the bench with a determination I hadn't felt in years. We're going to confront your father. Together. We walked back to Ethan's apartment arm in arm, like the grandmother and grandson we had been deprived of being for so long. Rachel opened the door with a nervous expression. Eleanor, Ethan is very upset. He says you had no right to— Right? I interrupted her, my voice unrecognizable even to myself. I am this boy's grandmother. I have every right in the world. We entered the living room where Ethan was waiting for us, clearly furious. Chloe and Parker had been sent to their rooms, probably to prevent them from witnessing the family drama that was about to erupt. What did you tell him? Ethan asked me without preamble. I told him the truth, I answered calmly. Something you never did. You had no right to stick your nose into matters that don't concern you. He's my grandson, I shouted, and the sound of my own raised voice surprised me as much as it did them. I hadn't yelled in years. I hadn't expressed anger so directly in years. My grandson, who I thought was dead for 17 years. Of course it concerns me. Ethan approached me with that intimidating look he used when he wanted to silence someone. Keep your voice down. The neighbors will hear. Let them hear, I shouted again. Let the whole building hear. The whole street. The whole of New York City if they have to. Let them know what kind of man you are. Rachel rushed to her husband's side, clearly alarmed by my behavior. For years, she had been accustomed to a submissive Eleanor, complaining but ultimately controllable. This new version of me unnerved her. Eleanor, please calm down. We can talk about this like civilized adults. I turned on her with a ferocity I had never expressed before. Civilized? Like when you shut the door in my face on my birthday? Like when you exchanged the gifts I bought for my grandchildren because they weren't appropriate? Like when you excluded me from Ethan's graduation, from Christmas dinners, from every important family celebration? Rachel recoiled, clearly shocked by the intensity of my response. I never wanted— Yes, you did, I cut her off. You wanted to erase me from this family from day one. You tolerated me when you needed me to babysit or for favors, but you never respected me as a person. Simon, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke. Dad, he said, and the words sounded strange coming from him, as if he were tasting something bitter. Is everything Grandma told me true? Ethan looked at him with a mix of irritation and calculated patience. Simon, you were too young to understand the complexities of the situation. I did what was best for everyone, including you. Best for me? Growing up with no family was what was best for me? You grew up in supervised foster homes, with professional caregivers. You received an education, medical care. All your basic needs were met. But not love, Simon said with devastating simplicity. I didn't receive love. Ethan looked uncomfortable for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. Love is a luxury, Simon. Survival and financial stability are necessities. I am offering you both now. No, Simon said, his voice surprisingly firm. Now you're offering me a business transaction. You want to use my inheritance. He's your father, Rachel intervened, probably sensing the conversation was spiraling out of control. You have mutual obligations. He gave up those obligations when he abandoned me as a baby, Simon replied, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. Do you know how many nights I lay awake as a child, wondering why my parents didn't want me? How many times I made up stories about who my family might be? I saw something break in Ethan's eyes. Not remorse, exactly, but a genuine discomfort. You were an obstacle, he finally said with brutal honesty. An obstacle to the life I wanted to build. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Rachel seemed shocked by the rawness of the admission. Well, Simon said after a long moment, now you're an obstacle to the life I want to build. He turned to me and held out his hand. Grandma, can we go? I don't want to be here anymore. I took his hand without hesitation. It was strange how that word, Grandma, spoken with genuine respect and affection, filled me with a strength I hadn't felt in decades. As we walked toward the door, Ethan yelled from behind us, Without my paternal recognition, you won't be able to claim a penny of that inheritance. You need me. Simon stopped and turned around slowly. No, he said calmly. I have DNA evidence available. I have the hospital records. I have my grandmother as a witness to the relationship between you and Isabella. And I have lawyers who can get this all resolved without your cooperation. Lawyers? With what money? Simon smiled for the first time since I'd known him, and it was exactly Isabella's smile. A very prestigious New York law firm has offered to represent me pro bono after hearing my story. Apparently, cases of child abandonment involving multi-million-dollar inheritances attract a lot of media attention. I saw the color drain from Ethan's face. His professional reputation, his social image, everything he had protected for 17 years was about to become public. "Simon, we can reach an agreement," he began to say. "I don't want to reach any agreement with you," my grandson interrupted. "The only thing I want is for you to leave me alone, me and my grandmother." We walked out of the apartment arm in arm, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was part of a real family, a family that chose each other, instead of one that endured each other out of obligation. Simon and I left the building without looking back. The morning air greeted us with a chill that felt like a release, as if New York City were offering us a new beginning. We walked aimlessly for several blocks, past closed storefronts and cafes that were just opening. Neither of us spoke. The silence was necessary to process what had happened. Every step was a mix of anger, relief, and a strange kind of hope. When we reached Washington Square Park, we sat on a stone bench. Simon rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. His body was trembling, not from the cold but from contained emotion. I watched him silently, recognizing in him gestures I had seen in Isabella and in Ethan when they were young, the way he bit his lip, the deep breath before speaking. "I don't know what to do now," he whispered without lifting his head. "It's too much." I leaned toward him and placed my hand on his shoulder. "The first thing is, you're not alone. That loneliness you felt for so many years, it's over." He looked up, his dark eyes full of questions. "What if he tries to take the inheritance from me? What if he accuses me of lying?" "We have the truth," I answered firmly. "The hospital records, your mother's policy, the DNA tests we can do. And above all, we have something that neither money nor his influence can erase. Our story." Simon nodded slowly. The anger from a few minutes ago was beginning to transform into determination. We spent the rest of the morning planning. I called the lawyer who had helped me when Anthony passed away, a discreet and honest woman named Teresa Wallace. She agreed to see us that same afternoon. Simon talked about his life in foster homes, the friends he had lost when moved from one place to another, the nights he wondered if his existence had any purpose. It pained me to listen, but it also filled me with pride to see the strength he had developed. "You survived," I told him. "That proves you're stronger than you can imagine." That afternoon, in Teresa's office, everything became clear. After reviewing the hospital documents and listening to our story, the lawyer was categorical. American law protects the biological child. It doesn't matter if Ethan tries to deny paternity. With the right evidence, Simon will be recognized and will inherit what is rightfully his. Furthermore, we can sue for abandonment. I saw a flash of fear in my grandson's eyes. "Sue him. It's your decision," Teresa clarified. "Not for revenge, but to create a legal record so no one can ever erase you again." We left the office with a plan: DNA testing, an official petition for recognition of paternity, and initiating the inheritance process. Simon walked taller, as if each step weighed less. That night, we had dinner together in my apartment. I made grilled cheese and tomato soup, a simple meal Isabella would have loved. Simon ate with appetite and a shy smile. For the first time, my table for two was truly occupied. "Grandma," he said, testing the word with a new glint in his eyes, "can I stay here for a few days?" I felt my heart might burst with joy. "This is your home." It always was. The following days were a mix of paperwork and simple moments I will cherish forever. Having breakfast together as the light streamed through the window, listening to him read excerpts from 100 Years of Solitude aloud, teaching him old songs I used to sing with Anthony. Every gesture erased years of absence. Ethan, however, was quick to react. The angry calls began, then the threatening texts. "You're destroying my life," one read. "You will regret this," said another. I didn't answer any of them. Neither did Simon. Teresa had advised us to save everything as evidence of harassment. One morning, Ethan showed up at my apartment door. He pounded so hard I feared the wood would give way. I opened it just enough to look at him. His face was red, his eyes bloodshot with rage. "Mom, this has to stop. You're ruining your own son. You're the one who ruined a life," I replied calmly. "Now, Simon and I are just seeking justice." He tried to force the door, but I slammed it shut. For the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt power. Simon, who had heard everything from the kitchen, came and hugged me. "Thank you for protecting me. It's what your mother would have wanted," I whispered. That afternoon, we received confirmation. The DNA test left no doubt. Ethan was the biological father. Teresa initiated the legal proceedings and, at the same time, contacted the lawyers managing Isabella's estate. The news traveled fast in certain circles. The local press started to take an interest. Suddenly, the story of the lost heir was making headlines. Ethan tried to negotiate secretly, offering money for us to drop the lawsuit. Simon was firm. "I don't want his money," he said in a call I put on speaker. "I want my truth." The following weeks felt like a rebirth. My apartment, once silent and gray, was filled with laughter, the smell of coffee, and plans for the future. Simon talked about studying literature, about traveling, about seeing the world he had always dreamed of. For the first time in decades, I started to imagine a shared tomorrow again. One Sunday afternoon, while we were walking through Central Park, he stopped in front of the pond. "Grandma, when I get the inheritance, I want you to live with me. I want us to leave this small apartment behind and have a house with a yard, like the one you shared with Grandpa." Tears blurred my vision. "The only thing I need is to know that I'll never lose you again." Simon hugged me tightly. "I promise you that." The trial began on a gray autumn morning, with a sky of heavy clouds that seemed to reflect the weight of everything at stake. Simon and I arrived at the New York County Supreme Court together, accompanied by Teresa, the lawyer who had guided every step of the process. As we climbed the marble steps, I felt a mix of pride and nervousness. We were about to face Ethan in public, with irrefutable proof and the press waiting at the doors. Inside the courtroom, the buzz of journalists and onlookers filled the air. Simon sat beside me, his back straight and his face serene, though his hands betrayed his tension. At the other end, Ethan and Rachel avoided our gaze. He looked impeccable in a dark suit that couldn't hide the sheen of sweat on his forehead. Rachel, rigid as a statue, kept her eyes fixed on the judge's bench. The judge, a woman with a firm voice and a sharp gaze, called the session to order. Teresa laid out the facts with surgical precision: Simon's birth, the hospital records, Isabella's insurance policy, the DNA test confirming Ethan's paternity. When she presented the voicemails in which he tried to buy our silence, a murmur went through the courtroom. Ethan tried to defend himself. He pleaded youth and immaturity, said he had acted under pressure, that he didn't know how to raise a baby alone after Isabella's death. His words sounded empty, like a poorly rehearsed script. The judge listened with an impassive face, but her questions cut like razors. "Mr. Vance, can you explain why you paid to have your son registered as an orphan?" she asked at a key moment. Ethan hesitated, looked at his lawyer, then at Rachel, and finally lowered his head. "I wanted to protect my personal and professional life," he admitted, almost in a whisper. That moment sealed his fate. No argument could erase such a confession. The verdict was clear. Simon was legally recognized as Ethan's son and the sole heir to Isabella's estate. Furthermore, the court opened an investigation into charges of abandonment and document falsification. The press, which had been taking notes silently, erupted in a frantic buzz. Outside, the camera flashes were blinding. Reporters from various outlets swarmed us for a statement. Simon, with surprising maturity, simply said, "I just want justice to be done. No one should grow up believing they have no family when they do." Then he took my hand and guided me out of the swarm of microphones. The following days were a whirlwind of news. The headlines spoke of the scandal of the hidden heir. TV shows analyzed the story, and social media was flooded with messages of support for Simon. We received letters from people who had experienced similar abandonments, from grandmothers who had never met their grandchildren, from young people still searching for their biological parents. Each message was a reminder that our fight was not just personal. It represented many. Ethan, on the other hand, watched his reputation crumble. His company began to lose clients, the social invitations dried up, and, we heard, even Rachel started to question their marriage. It was not my intention to destroy him, but every consequence seemed inevitable. He had made his choices. Now he had to face the results. While all this was happening, the bond between Simon and me flourished. We turned my afternoons into small rituals, walking through Central Park, cooking family recipes, reading the books his mother loved together. I discovered a sensitivity in him that reminded me of Isabella, his love for poetry, the way he listened with his whole body, his ability to find beauty in simple things. One day, while we were having hot chocolate in a downtown cafe, Simon looked at me with a mix of shyness and determination. "Grandma, I've been thinking. When I receive the inheritance, I want to create a foundation with part of the money, one that helps children in the foster care system, so they don't have to go through what I went through." A lump formed in my throat. "Your mother would be so proud. And I am too. I want it to be named after her," he added. "The Isabella Hayes Foundation, so that no one ever forgets who she was and what she meant." Tears streamed down my face. I squeezed his hand tightly, grateful that love and memory had triumphed over cruelty. Months later, the day came when Simon signed the documents that made him the heir. The ceremony, discreet but solemn, took place in a law office in Chicago, the city where his maternal grandparents had left their properties. Upon receiving the keys to the family home, he asked me to accompany him to see it. It was an old mansion with neglected gardens full of potential. As we walked through the dusty corridors, the afternoon light filtered through the large windows, painting the walls gold. Simon stopped in a spacious room, decorated with old portraits of the Hayes family. "This is where I want to start over," he said. "And this is where I want you to have a place, Grandma. I want you to live with me." I couldn't hold back my tears. I caressed his cheek, feeling under my fingers the continuity of blood, of the history that Isabella had protected even from the distance of death. "You promised you would never lose me," I reminded him. "And I'll keep that promise," he affirmed with a smile that was the perfect reflection of his mother's. Over time, the foundation Simon dreamed of began to take shape. Children from different corners of the country found a refuge where they received educational, psychological, and, above all, human support. Every time I saw one of those little ones running through the gardens of the Hayes house, I felt that Isabella was watching us with pride, that her sacrifice had not been in vain. Ethan, meanwhile, disappeared from our lives. There was one last attempt at contact, a letter in which he awkwardly apologized, speaking more of his lost reputation than of the pain he had caused. Simon chose not to reply. "Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation," he told me with a maturity that moved me. "I'm moving on from it, but I'm not letting it back in." Today, when I walk through the foundation's gardens and hear the children's laughter, I feel that my life, which for years seemed like a series of losses, has finally found its meaning. The loneliness of my small apartment in Queens is just a memory. Now I wake up every morning in a house full of voices, with the certainty that love, even if it's late, always finds its way. I've learned that blood isn't just biology. It's choice, it's care, it's memory. That a grandmother can become a mother when life demands it. And that a young man who grew up believing he was an orphan can transform pain into hope for many others. Life lesson. The truth can take years to come to light, but it always finds a way. The bonds of love, though broken by lies, can be reborn stronger than before. No one has the right to erase our history or decide who deserves to be loved. Have you ever known someone who hid or discovered a family secret that changed everything? Tell me in the comments if you or someone close has experienced something similar. If this story moved you, leave your like and subscribe so that this message of truth and hope can reach those who need it most.